And Abby, if you can go to the next slide, please. Perfect. Before we get started, I'd like to go over today's agenda first. To start us off, Kevin Bowes, the President and CEO of the New Market Support Company, which is also a subsidiary of LISC, will be providing us with a broad overview of the Opportunity Zones program. His discussion will include information on what the program is, how it aims to attract private investments to underserved areas, and what to expect over the next phases as the Opportunity Zone program becomes implemented. And unfortunately, we can't have Matt Joseph join us today due to this wintry mixed weather that we have unfortunately caused travel delays, but we're very thankful to have Kevin to cover both sections, so thank you to him. Before we move on to the next section of our program, we'll take a brief pause after Kevin is done to take a few questions from the audience. If you would like to submit a question for Kevin as he is talking, you can use the chat box function, and you can send a question to all the panelists for us to see. As I said, questions can be submitted at any time throughout the presentation. And after Kevin's presentation, I will then introduce Callie New, who is a transportation planner for the Wasatch Front Regional Council for our Regional Perspective segment. She will be sharing the role of Wasatch Front in designating opportunity zones in Utah and potential opportunities this program presents for their organization and their region. She will then invite you to participate in a discussion she will facilitate and take your questions as well. Please note that you will be muted throughout most of the webinar. During Callie's discussion period, we will unmute you so you have the chance to offer comments or ask questions. But we will ask that you please mute yourself during that part of the segment so we can minimize all background noise. And with that, I will turn it over to Kevin.
Great. Hi, everyone. Excited to talk to you all today about Opportunity Zones. So I lead LISC New Market Support Company, and based in Chicago, I have a team of 20 that focuses on new markets, tax credit financing, and financing both businesses and real estate developments around the country. And we're excited to have the Opportunity Zone incentive as part of our toolkit moving forward. So to start with, what are Opportunity Zones? So this is a new tax incentive that passed last December as part of the big tax bill. This is not a new idea. Actually, something very similar to this incentive was proposed as long as 20 years ago, but it took a lot of hard work to make this part of the tax law, and that work was led by a group called the Economic Innovation Group, founded by Sean Parker of Napster and Facebook fame, who put together this group in Washington, D.C. that both has done a lot of great research on the topics of the disinvestment in a broad part of our country, and a lobbying team that did the hard work with Congress to get this program put into place. So next slide. So the idea behind this tax incentive is some of which is laid out here on this slide, is just the broad idea that all of you are probably already live regularly, of the disparity in wealth creation and business creation across the country. The trend in business starts where 5 metro areas alone in our country created as many jobs and new businesses as the entire rest of the country over the last 5 years or so. And in addition to the rates of poverty and income rates in a lot of these places that are far below the rest of the country. And so the idea here is to produce an incentive for economic investors to put their capital into these places that are not seeing enough of it otherwise. Next slide. So the way that this incentive got put together is by designating opportunity zones. And so the way this started after the tax law was passed in December was that in January, the governors of each state got the task of designating these zones. And so the pool that they got to start with was all of the low-income census tracts in their state, as well as some minimal potential to pick tracts that are contiguous to those low-income community census tracts. And so generally speaking, these low-income tracts are about 40% of our country, and 25% of that were designated opportunity zones. So now about 10% of the country is designated opportunity zones. Next slide. So here's some stats on these zones. So they all got picked largely in the first quarter into April by the governors, and the states that did it right had a lot of engagement from mayors and from county commissioners and from community development practitioners in their states in choosing the right zones. And these zones, now that they're chosen, are set and in place for a 10-year period. So a lot of questions get asked about is there the potential for new zones to be chosen, or another bite at the apple here? And the answer, at least for the foreseeable future, is no. These tracts that have been picked are in place for the next 10 years, and these are the zones. And so stats on these zones across the country, there's 8,762 of them. And you can see the number of jobs and businesses that are in these places, and hopefully we will see both of those numbers grow over this 10-year period. Average poverty rates in these zones are 31%, about double the national average. Average unemployment far above the less than 4% total unemployment rate in the country. And average family income in these 8,762 tracts is about 60% of the area median income. Next slide. So those are the opportunity zones, and so if you want to figure out where these zones are, there's a lot of good mapping tools out there. The CDFI fund has a mapping tool, as well as some of the accounting firms, Novogradac and others that are in the New Markets Tax Credit business. So Google Opportunity Zone Map, and you can plug in an address and find out if your project or where in your area these zones are. So then the next piece of this puzzle with this new tax incentive is, how do you invest in these zones? So all of this capital, to be eligible for the tax incentive, has to flow through opportunity funds. So what are these funds? They're actually pretty simple. It's just a new entity, an LLC or corporation or partnership formed for the purpose of investing in opportunity zones. And once you form that entity, there's some rules to get the tax incentive in terms of how much capital needs to be invested in opportunity zone property, and what that property needs to look like. But largely, setting up these funds is going to be a wide open ballgame that anyone could set up an opportunity fund, and the only certification or compliance related to that is to include some forms along with your tax return at the end of the year that says that you have formed an opportunity fund. Next slide. So the incentives that investors are eligible for if they invest in an opportunity fund are three pieces. One is a deferral of taxes. So all of this capital, to be eligible for the incentive, has to be from capital gains. And So an investor has an option if they sell their Amazon stock today, that they can either pay the capital gains tax on that this year in their tax return, which would be at a 24% or so national rate, or if they invest in an opportunity fund and follow the rules of this incentive, they can defer the payment of that tax all the way until 2026. Also, you can get a reduction in that tax bill by as much as 15%. And then the third incentive is that the new investment that gets made in the opportunity fund, any appreciation on that investment can be completely tax-free if the capital is kept in the opportunity fund investment for over 10 years. Next slide. So this slide is just an attempt to lay out these tax incentives. The top row is the tax on the capital gain that's invested. So after the gain is realized by an investor, they have 180 days to put their capital into an opportunity fund. They leave it there for 5 years, and they get a 10% reduction in that tax while still having not had to pay it. After the 7-year mark, that 10% turns into 15% reduction in that tax, and then per the statute, all of those taxes that would otherwise be owed now are due in 2026. So that is a hard date in the statute. And if you were to liquidate your opportunity fund investment prior to that 2026 date, then taxes would be due when you liquidate the investment. And then the bottom row relates to the tax on the new investment in the opportunity fund, which is a fully taxable investment if it's less than 10 years in duration. But if you leave that capital in an opportunity fund and invest it in the opportunity zone for over 10 years, then there's no tax on any appreciation of that investment. So here's an attempt to put some numbers to this. So on the left side, the economics related to a fully taxable investment of $100,000, and on the right side, the economics if that were to be invested through an opportunity fund. And so you can see that assuming a 10% annual appreciation or annual return, that over that 10-year span, in a fully taxed investment, you'd have $168,000, and in an opportunity fund investment, you'd have $238,000 in your bank account at the end of a 10-year investment period. Next slide. So the key pieces of the incentive, so from the investor standpoint, there's an incentive to invest long-term with that 10-year tax-free incentive. There's a short window to invest that capital after you realize the capital gain, and so timing constraints to be kept in mind there. And then after the capital is invested in an opportunity fund, there's another short window to get that capital deployed, 6 months to invest it into a project or a business, with beyond the 6 months, then a 30-month window to fully deploy that capital, with the idea of being construction period or substantial rehab that could last for a 30-month period. This capital must be an equity investment from these investors and also an equity investment into the project. So this is not a loan program. This is a equity investment incentive. On the fund side of things, so to be eligible for the tax incentive, all the capital must flow through an opportunity fund, and then you have to meet the requirement of 90% of those fund assets being invested in the zones to get the full benefit of the tax incentive for the amount that's invested in the fund. In terms of what can be invested in, again, must be an equity investment in an asset that is in the zone, which could be real estate, or could be a business, or could even be equipment. but the biggest constraint on the eligible investments is this substantial rehabilitation rule, where whatever you invest in, you have to double the basis. So if you're investing in a property that's land and building, the value of the land is excluded, but whatever the initial basis of the building is, you have to double that basis, or if the building's worth $1 million, you got to invest another $1 million within 30 months. So this can't be used for existing cash flowing real estate assets. This is for new real estate development or substantial rehabilitation deals, and the same rule applies for business investment. So you can't just park your capital in a business that's established and not growing in the zone. Either that business has got to be doubling in size, or this is going to work well for businesses that are relocating to the opportunity zone, or are expanding and opening a new storefront or facility in an opportunity zone. There's constraints in the incentive related to sin businesses not being eligible, which includes golf courses and suntan parlors and things like that. Same rules as new market tax credits there. And then also a requirement that the property be used in active conduct of business, which means, at least as it currently stands, like a triple net lease investment would not be eligible. There's got to be some active conduct by the investors, not just a passive investment. So the eligible investments, it really can be just about anything. Any piece of property that's located in one of these opportunity zones can include businesses, real estate, and equipment and other assets. Next slide. The next two slides here, just kind of stepping back for a minute on, from the LISC perspective, what we see as the strengths and some concerns related to this new tax incentive. So some strengths. One, at least for the states that did it right, they really engaged local stakeholders and governments in the process of designating these zones, and so the municipalities and community stakeholders have some buy-in and are excited to make use of this incentive in the places that were chosen. It's a flexible tool that can support a broad array of investments. What's really exciting for us at LISC and beyond is that this incentive is going to bring a new class of investors to our work. Largely for the past 40 years, we've worked with banks that invest with us for CRA purposes, and foundations and government programs as our main areas of support, and this incentive is going to bring in individual investors and corporations that can support our work and will hopefully be opportunity zone investors, but that we can also attract more broadly to our community development work across the country. The potential here is huge, and these other federal tax incentives that we work with, new markets tax credits, loan housing tax credits, etc., all are capped where there's only a certain amount of volume that can be done every year. This is an uncapped investment that's only limited by the dollars that can be attracted to it and the deals that we can find around the country. Finally, it's a pretty straightforward tool, and there's not going to be the transaction costs embedded in these deals that there are in utilizing some of the other tax credit programs. Next slide. So the concerns related to this opportunity zone tax incentive, one is that there is very limited oversight here and potential for abuse of the tax incentive. This is sort of front and center in the news over the last 2 days with Amazon and their new HQ2 in New York, which is in an opportunity zone, and you know, the potential for a company like Amazon to benefit from this tax incentive. But you know, a lot of potential for abuse if this isn't done right, because the only oversight is through the IRS and tax reporting process. And second is there are no impact incentives whatsoever embedded in this legislation, and so it really is going to rely on the private market and puts a big onus on us in the community development space to make sure investors and the community understands that you know, the purpose of this tool is for investments that will benefit the residents of these zones. There's some concern over this because this incentive, so much of the financial incentive is related to appreciating investments, that this works a lot better for luxury housing than it does for affordable housing, and that this could be an issue in terms of the housing stock being replaced over this 10-year period and current residents having to move out of these zones. So that's something that we're going to be paying close attention to. And then finally, as bore itself out in December when this incentive was being passed, there's still remains some confusion by Congress and the idea that maybe New Markets tax credits aren't needed anymore because we now have opportunity zones. And so we have some continual policy work to do to make sure that our members of Congress know the difference and realize that this is not or cannot even be close to a replacement for what we can do with New Markets tax credits and the subsidy rate that comes along with that, and also you know, that we can cover a much broader section of low-income communities across the country with New Markets tax credits, and these opportunity zones are, while there are 25% of them, is still a small slice of all the places that we work across the country. Next slide. So just a few examples, and as we're starting to look at some live deals now, and some of this are deal opportunities we're seeing. So on the economic development side of things, you know, seeing potential here for investing in new business infrastructure real estate, so industrial, retail, mixed-use office buildings in these zones. In terms of business investment, because of the substantial rehabilitation rule, this works well for early-stage businesses, although there's a constraint to that in that there's a rule that 50% of the income of these businesses has to come from the opportunity zone itself, and so you know, this isn't going to work well for a technology company where all of their revenue is generated outside of the opportunity zone. And in terms of investing in operating businesses, as I mentioned previously, this is going to work well for businesses that are moving into or expanding into the zone. And then we're also seeing this as a good tool in our toolkit to go along with New Markets tax credits or historic tax credits or the other tools that we use to, as we're piecing together the lasagna financing to make the projects that we work on come together. So issues to consider related to economic development investments, you know, this substantial rehabilitation rule, and this gross income rule that we mentioned. Another one that I haven't mentioned is the 70% rule, where if you're investing in a business, 70% or more of its assets must be located in the opportunity zone. This could apply to real estate as well, and where if you've got a project that's partially in an opportunity zone and partially outside of the zone, as long as 70% of it is in the opportunity zone, it's still all eligible for investment. And there's more guidance that we're expecting related to the ability to buy and sell projects within an opportunity fund and keep the tax incentives flowing, and so still remains to be determined whether a kind of traditional private equity fund model can be utilized here, where you can buy and sell assets over a 10-year period and while still keeping the tax incentives flowing. On the affordable housing side of things, and as mentioned, this can work for housing that's not affordable as well. We're using affordable housing examples as that is our focus at LISC. And so there's potential and no prohibition on using this with other tax credit programs. So this could be a yield booster for low-income housing tax credit or historic tax credit transactions. And where we're focusing most of our attention is on workforce rental housing and using this as a tool to get more of those projects that are at the 80% to 120% AMI income levels for the tenants developed around the country. Also see great potential, and as we're looking at this incentive and at the coming 10 years of sustained investment in these opportunity zones, we're going to be pushing for models that enable resident ownership of assets so they can have some benefit from this appreciation as it occurs. So lease to own housing or lease to own business real estate is something that we're interested in pursuing with opportunity zones. So issues to consider on the housing side of things, as we're looking at workforce and affordable housing, it's really a risk-return issue, and trying to find that return level that works to keep this housing affordable and make the cash flows work, but is also enough to attract investment capital to these. Also, the issue of responsible exits comes into play here, and as we're thinking about the 10-year mark down the road, and not just having a straight sale of these assets, but keeping them in the hands of owners that want to keep these units affordable, and so trying to structure deals for continued affordability is a front and center issue. So who are these mysterious opportunity zone investors? So from the LISC perspective, there are a few of these in our current network and list of investors. Banks largely do not have capital gains, at least not sustainable or regularly occurring capital gains at a level where they're planning to be investors themselves, although the banks will certainly be in this game from the perspective of putting debt into these deals and hopefully using their wealth management arms to find investors in their client base. But insurance companies are organizations that are already in our space investing in low-income housing tax credits and largely have capital gains to invest. So that's an area we're focusing. And then working with community foundations and those groups that we already partner with and their client base that are a lot of capital gains investors. And then looking beyond our current space to individual investors that are either interested in investing back in their community or are already using their philanthropic dollars to support community development projects are targets for being opportunity zone investors. So technical issues related to this, and this could be a couple hours on its own here, but I've at least hit on all these things a bit. So 90% has to be invested in the zone, the substantial rehabilitation rule, the substantially all rule of 70% of the property being located in the zone, and then still some open questions as to early disposition and the ability to buy and sell assets within an opportunity fund. So broad investor market and deal structuring issues. It's a lot of still open questions here in terms of what investor requirements are going to be from a risk-return perspective, how we address all the timing issues embedded in the tax incentive. 10-year holds without any liquidity are generally an issue for individual and corporate investors, and so finding ways to make that work with such a long-term investment. And then what sort of indemnities or guarantees the investors are going to require is still an open issue, as well as the impact reporting, which we're hoping will ultimately be required at the federal level, but if not, working with states and municipalities to the extent that they have some carrots to bring towards these projects, that they can use that to require some impact reporting and some transparency in terms of the investment activity that's happening in their zones. Deal structures, I'll skip for now, but a lot of different ways to look at structuring these funds. So how do you market an opportunity zone project to an investor? This is certainly still a live question for us at LISC and for the broad industry and a lot of folks that are out there trying to be matchmakers in terms of matching projects to investors. What I'm most excited about, and we are broadly at LISC, is to use this tool at a local level to get local investors focused on investing back in their community, and so thinking about, and we're working around the country to figure out how we can bring the right stakeholders to the table locally and have an investment strategy that attracts investors to their city or town. So what is next? So this first set of regulations just came out a month ago on October 19th. There's a 60-day comment period, although investors are held harmless, so we're open for business right now in terms of doing opportunity zone deals, because as long as you act within the guidelines laid out in the proposed regulations, you're okay from an IRS and tax perspective to invest and get a tax opinion and know that you're going to receive these tax benefits. But us and many others are going to be submitting comments on these proposed regs and expect that there will be some changes to the regulations after this 60-day comment period. We're already starting to see some opportunity funds and expect a lot more activity in 2019. And then a lot of questions as to can the community development and social impact space come together on this, or is this going to be a tool that a lot of the folks that have stepped out early on this are more traditional real estate private equity funds and hedge funds that do not have much of a stake in the outcomes for the residents of these communities. And so whether this can ultimately be used in a way that benefits residents and stays around as part of the tax code is an open question at this point. So just quickly on LISC's roles in opportunity zones. So we are planning on having our own opportunity funds. Currently, we're just working on financing projects on a on a project-by-project basis, but we'll hopefully have a national fund early in 2019. We also, on my team, have a group that does fund management and back office services for other folks in the new market tax credit industry, and we're offering those services to opportunity fund investors and sponsors. And then we already are and will continue to provide debt financing and other financing for these types of projects. And our national policy team is front and center in terms of industry leadership and trying to make, as much as we can, make this a tool that works for the community development industry and can drive capital into the types of deals that are important to our local communities. So last slide here is just a resources page. So LISC.org/opportunity zones can get you to a lot more information and in-depth information on this topic. And there's my contact info, and feel free to reach out directly with any follow-up conversations or questions if they don't get addressed on the webinar today.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kevin, for your presentation. So right now we're going to move into a few questions that we've received through the chat function. And during this time, please feel free to submit more questions as they come up. We have a few in the queue now. One of them is, are there incentives specifically to partnering with public agencies, or is it presumed to be a natural byproduct of things like transit-oriented development / affordable housing incentives?
Yeah, I think the latter, so nothing specific in terms of working with local government, but at least with the types of deals that we work on that are bringing in all types of resources, it's going to happen naturally.
And we have another question. What should communities with opportunity zones do to prepare for investment or attract investment into their opportunity zones?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's some interesting things that are already happening and some good examples out there. If you just Google Opportunity Zone Prospectus, you'll see publicly available, there's some marketing documents that different cities have put together. Erie, Pennsylvania is an example. Oklahoma City and Louisville are a couple others. And so those cities have put together marketing documents that they're getting widely out on the street to pitch their city and what type of investment that their city is looking for. Another way to get in front of this, and an example from our Indianapolis LISC office, is where they've taken the lead on bringing together a consortium of folks in the city. So local stakeholders from government and community development, along with developers and investors, and all coming together and working together towards the goal of getting projects that are community priorities financed. And there will, I'm sure, be other good examples soon of ways that communities are rallying to make sure that they can take advantage of this tool.
Yeah, I know a lot of localities are trying to figure that out themselves. So we have one last question, and again, Kevin has provided his contact information if you have questions after the presentation. But our last question will be, can non-capital gains still be invested in an opportunity fund for the next 10-year tax break?
No, they can't. So they can still be invested in the fund on a taxable basis, but all of the tax incentive, including the 10-year incentive, are only eligible if it's capital gains that are invested in the fund.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin. We're going to move on to the next portion, and Kelly.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you, and thanks to NARC for hosting us on this webinar. So Wasatch Front Regional Council is the metropolitan planning organization for the Salt Lake City urbanized area. So our planning area covers about 4 counties, 6 counties when we're acting as an association of governments along the Wasatch Mountains. There's about 60 cities within our planning area. You could go to the next slide. So today I'm going to give a brief overview on WFRC's involvement in the Opportunity Zone designation, what our role was in designating qualified opportunity zones, and then share some thoughts about what we're thinking about for the future of opportunity zones within the context of our regional planning, transportation planning, and land use visioning. And then also, thirdly, I would like to do some discussion as the opportunity zones are such a new concept and we haven't had a ton of experience. We'd love to hear what you all are thinking about in this space and to learn from you as well. So Wasatch Front's role in the Opportunity Zone designation, we play fairly frequently in the space of convening cities and counties together around future infrastructure investment decisions and land use visioning. And so we took advantage of that existing healthy ongoing relationship that we had or have with cities and worked with the Governor's Office of Economic Development and the Department of Workforce Services to provide information to cities and counties as they were looking at opportunity zones. Each city that had an eligible tract was invited to submit to the state sort of like a best business case for why their tract should be nominated as or designated as an opportunity zone. And so we worked with the state to provide cities with the information of how to do that and then work to give that information back to the state. So designating the opportunity zones in Utah was really a locally driven process with the state, looking at all of the eligible tracts at the end and why the cities would like their tracts nominated from there. Next slide, please. So as we're thinking about opportunity zones moving forward as they've already been designated, we're thinking about that in the context of our regional growth plan, the Wasatch Choice 2050 vision. So we work with local government to ensure planning and development decisions are coordinated with regional transportation and understanding that when they're coordinated, they have quality of life benefits such as higher transit ridership, air quality, economic development, housing choice, access to opportunities, and when they're coordinated that they can benefit our vulnerable populations that are living within these opportunity zone census tracts. So we're thinking about opportunity zones in the context of our regional growth plans and thinking about how we can align these plans with the program. Next slide, please. This is the Wasatch Choice 2050 vision. It has both future transportation investments as well as regional land use designation. So where is our regional centers or our neighborhood centers, and what can investing in those areas, what benefits can that bring to communities and the broader region? Next slide, please. So when we're looking at the opportunity zones, these are the ones that have been designated within Salt Lake County. Salt Lake City is there to the north, and we see that the way that it shook out was that a lot of the opportunity zones were aligned with our major transportation facilities that are already on the ground today. So in the white is our major interstates, and then our tracks and, our light rail and commuter rail lines are in the sort of dotted line. So we can see that there already is an alignment. And then next slide. We're also looking at the alignment with the Wasatch Choice centers or regional centers, urban centers, city centers, neighborhood centers, and employment areas. So we're trying to think strategically about which zones could advance the goals of the Wasatch Choice centers, and again, what are the benefits of investing in that center? Why would it be valuable to invest in those areas? And how can the job growth benefit when it's linked to transportation? And so a second thought that we're thinking about is how we can fund future transportation investments by leveraging this program. So the state legislature in the last session allowed transportation reinvestment zones, or it's basically TIF, tax increment financing tools. So that's a new tool that we're exploring as a region. And so how can we leverage that opportunity to align land use and transportation investments together? Next slide, please. So where these dark areas are designated opportunity zones. And so where those exist today, if we also establish a transportation reinvestment zone there and then use the opportunity zone program to sort of kickstart development, would there be an opportunity for value capture to fund these future transportation projects and coordinate the land use development in tandem with, say, a bus rapid transit line or a new light rail facility? So how can we, again, leverage the two programs together to align regional benefits? And so along those lines, how can WFRC assist local communities in implementing the opportunity zones? And so we have next slide, please. We have a technical assistance program through our MPO called the Transportation and Land Use Connection. And through that program, we help local governments do planning for new development that has transportation benefits. So we try to focus on projects that might be like a corridor study or a small area plan, but areas that have a strong link between transportation and land use so that we can utilize or bump up ridership on existing transit facilities, enable shorter commutes, and help our vulnerable populations get to work and employment opportunities. So I have an example of this on the next slide. So this is an example of a project that we might do through the Transportation and Land Use Connection program. We have a future BRT project that will be linking from our existing commuter rail station to a university in the city of Ogden. So the dark areas, again, are the opportunity zones within the community, and so it's obviously a community with high concentrations of lower income populations, and how do we help them to build a better life? And so connecting to the university is a great way to do that. And so looking through the lens of the Opportunity Zones program, if we wanted to hone in and do a market and land use analysis, make redevelopment recommendations, and then eventually have the policy in place through zoning or other economic development strategies to implement the opportunity zones and the future land use vision that the community would like, in tandem with developing this future bus rapid transit line. So to kind of sum it up, the way that Wasatch Front is thinking about this program is through the lens of the Wasatch Choice 2050 vision, and to think about the alignment between the Opportunity Zones program and locations with large regional benefits and connecting our lower income populations to those opportunities. And then two, how can this program help us to finance future investments? And three, to help communities hone in on specific areas that they'd like to already move their work along, and how can this program help to implement some of those ideas and visions that have already been set in place. So with that, I'd love to have some discussion. If any of you would like to share, what role do you think that your AOG has in opportunity zones? How are you thinking about the opportunity zones in your region? And are there other tools that you're using in tandem with the program to guide future development?
And before we go into the discussion, I'm just going to unmute everyone so we can kind of test out a live discussion. But if there's a lot of background noise, we might have to mute everyone again. But just a reminder, I'm unmuting everyone now.
Okay, did anyone, yeah, thank you. Thank you. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, just as people are thinking sort of about their own roles and potential things they want to do with opportunity zones, I just wanted to present some ideas that CAPCOG, the Capital Area Council of Governments, has been thinking about. They've done a lot of presentations about opportunity zones in Austin, Texas, and some of the bigger questions they're thinking about are what role should my organization play in implementing the program in the region, much like what Callie was talking about, whether they should convene a planning process around opportunity zones, should they try to run a qualified opportunity fund themselves, and should they be focusing on a specific subset of tracts, like rural versus urban. Another one is the types of projects that could be eligible for investment are extremely broad. So how do they establish project priorities? What are the relevant stakeholders they should potentially be working with? Is there a focus area for a project that aligns with their broader strategic vision, like Callie was talking about? And the final big question I think they're thinking of is where will productive projects come from? A couple of concerns they have is that the private sector probably aren't leaving a lot of productive projects on the table. And concerning housing, they're concerned that they might overheat real estate markets in some opportunity zones by accelerating projects that would maybe already happen anyway. But a possible value proposition they see under this is that regional development organizations are uniquely situated to bring together stakeholders to develop new projects, just like you all do every day, bringing and convening stakeholders together to talk about the broader issues that are impacting your region. So, as Callie said, it'd be interesting to hear from you guys whether or not these are some of the things that you're thinking about, if you're thinking about other things. So, I'll let her take over again.
Thanks, Macy. Those are great questions. Did anyone on the call want to share?
I had one additional question. We have a number of rural communities that put opportunity zones in, and they're concerned that they don't have the capital asset capacity to draw local investors in. They're already tapped out supporting the nonprofits that exist. So that may be one other question to throw into the hopper is all those states that did put in opportunity zones in the rural areas are anxiously wondering how to attract outside investors. So I don't need to have an answer today. That's just one of our questions.
Yeah, that's a great question.
And hi, this is Cynthia Kroll from MTC and ABAG in the Bay Area. And I guess my question is what different organizations are doing about the whole problem of displacement, and how do you encourage projects that will help build the resources of the community rather than replace what's there?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that the Wasatch Front is grappling with currently. We're a very rapidly growing area, and so the state actually is looking at mechanisms for rent control and inclusionary zoning and those types of things. But again, that kind of comes down to the city.
Hey, Callie, we have one question that came in through a separate chat function. Did WFRC also do any CIP amendments to reallocate funding for areas that have opportunity zones?
We did not. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the acronym GIP funding.
Oh, I'm sorry, it was CIP Amendments.
GIP Amendments. Okay. We didn't. I don't believe. I'm not familiar with the acronym.
Transportation Improvement Program, sorry. CIP.
Sorry, I was hearing G. Okay, CIP Amendments. No, we did not. Thank you for clarifying. But in the future, as our next TIP cycle comes around, that might be something that we should consider for future projects.
And I think this is a question for everyone on the webinar. Someone asked, are SIN businesses, do they only include restaurants/bars or breweries, or are those included?
Restaurants and bars are fine, but liquor stores are not.
So would that also exclude breweries?
No, I think breweries are okay.
Okay. Great. Were there any other cities or communities that wanted to share any of the ways that they're thinking about opportunity zones or strategies that they're implementing?
Hey, Callie, we have one question that came in. It's asking if you have brought a diversity of stakeholders together to talk about this issue, or if you've held any convenings to talk about opportunity zones in your area.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we supported the county in hosting open houses to get feedback from affordable housing providers and human service providers, et cetera, people that were really interested in where these opportunity zones would be. As I'm sure you all remember, the period for designating the zones was pretty quick, and so we did, at the end of the designation period, the county provided opportunity for public comment, but we kind of let the cities determine how they wanted to designate or recommend the zones, and then supported their efforts when they were doing something for outreach. I'm curious if other Association of Governments or MPOs played a role in designating opportunity zones, or if it was largely state-driven, if anyone wanted to share.
This is Sam Shinbago with the Atlanta Regional Commission, and in one case, it was primarily, we weren't responsible in the designation and mainly that effort. It's great to hear about some of the work that Trent is doing in this, because it's getting us on the back end of it, and we get working with our communities to
Great. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, we're getting a little bit too much background noise. So if you have any questions or want to continue the discussion, you can use the chat function in WebEx. So I'm just going to go ahead and mute everyone, but we hope that you can still provide some questions, comments, concerns after this discussion.
Feel free to email me, and I'm happy to connect you. My email is Macy, maci.morin, MORIN, @narc.org, and I believe that you saw both of the emails of our presenters on the slides, but we will have access to this recording, which we will be more than happy to pass along, as well as the PowerPoint presentation very soon. And I just wanted to thank our presenters, Callie and Kevin, again for joining us this afternoon, and for Abby for helping us put this on. And be sure to visit LISC.org. It's LISC.org to learn more about their organization and the wonderful impact that they're making through their more than 30 local offices across the U.S. And I'd like to thank you for your attendance, and we look forward to your participation on future NARC webinars, and I hope you all have a great day.